Hello and welcome to our discussion on fallacies. In this video, we are going to define what fallacies are, and we're going to look at some of the most common fallacies that we see in everyday arguments, and as well as these are fallacies that we tend to incorporate in our lives as we make that sort of ingrained in our psychology a little bit, so where we will use these fallacies when we make our own decisions and our own judgments, right? And so we will look at those as well. So, what is a fallacy? A fallacy is a failure in reasoning or a flaw in an argument that makes it unsound, invalid, or misleading. So, if you think of an argument basically has three components, right? You have your conclusion, and your conclusion is supported by some sort of evidence or data or some sort of reason you've reached that conclusion, right? And then typically there is a warrant or an unstated assumption that has to be true to connect the two. So I mentioned before, if you have the conclusion, you say that dog is probably friendly. And my reason for that is I say it's a golden retriever. The warrant is that golden retrievers must be friendly, right? That's what connects the two. Because if that is not true, then my reason for thinking golden retrievers are friendly just makes no sense, right? So you have these three components here. So where something becomes a fallacy is where there's just something wrong with one of those. Okay. So for example, some of the common fallacies you'll see is there's something wrong with the conclusion. So let's say you have a piece of evidence or data, something that supports your argument, and it's totally true. It's completely true. That does not guarantee your conclusion's accurate that you reach from it. For example, your conclusion could be too broad. So you have a piece of evidence, you draw a conclusion from it, but that conclusion is way too far sweeping, right? That's an example of a potential fallacy. Another problem could be there is some sort of issue with your reasoning. So, how you're connecting the two pieces of information, the evidence and the conclusion, you're not really drawing the right conclusion. For example, you should be because you're not connecting those two correctly, right? So, there's some sort of problem with your reasoning. So, basically, there's just something going on with one of these components that's making something a potential fallacy. So let's start talking about some of the most common ones. So the first two you have here, bandwagon and slippery slope. What do we got going on here? So a slippery slope is the assumption that if you take one step, it must lead to others, okay? So what that's basically saying is I've already started going in one direction, I might as well keep going. Okay? So it's like I've already crossed the line in the sand, might as well keep walking on the beach. Now, why is this a logical fallacy? So, what the problem here is that just because you took one step doesn't mean that you have to take the other, right? So the past does not have to equal the future. What you just did does not have to influence the next thing. But yet, if you think about it, we often do this. Like, this is a good example of one that slippery slope thinking is kind of ingrained in our psychology a little bit, right? So, where you see this all the time, where people do something like, well, I might as well keep going because I've done this, right? I've used this example before. It's like somebody who's on a diet. Somebody starts a diet and they start the diet on Monday. They're cruising along and it's Friday, right? And they've done everything perfect on the diet, okay? They're going to the gym every day, they're eating healthy, whatever it may be. And their friend says, want to go to lunch? And you're like, I can handle it. Sure. You go to lunch, and the next thing you know, you've blown your diet. Now, you get out of that lunch, you've blown your diet. What does the typical person say? Do they go, okay, bad lunch there, but I'm going to immediately get right back on my diet? Now, that's probably what they should say, right? That's probably what you should do. But a lot of people, what they do is they go, well, hey, cheat day, right? And they eat stuff that's unhealthy for them or overeat the rest of the day. And then, unfortunately, a lot of them will also then go, okay, they wake up on Saturday. They've already just had a day where they ate a bunch of like really unhealthy food. Let's say they ate a bunch of junk food, right? So then they're like, well, it's kind of hard like to get back on a diet when you just had a day where you ate a bunch of bad food, right? And so a lot of times they'll go like, well, hey, cheat weekend, right? I'll start again on Monday. You can't start on Saturday. That's crazy talk, right? They start again on Monday. Now, what just happened there? Slippery slope thinking, right? They crossed the line in the sand. They let one bad lunch on Friday lead to 3 days where they did not eat healthy, they did not stay back on their diet, right? And by the way, in this example of the like, I crossed the line in the sand, I might as well keep going, slippery slope thinking, this is actually really destructive. Because in this hypothetical, this type of thinking is actually what stopped you from reaching your goal. Okay, there's a phrase that's been used a lot in you may have heard this quote before, but don't let perfection be the enemy of good. Don't let perfection be the enemy of good. And what that's talking about is oftentimes in our head we hold ourselves to this standard of perfection, such as people that like, if you go on a lot of diets and they go, all right, I'm going to be perfect and I am going to, I'm going to run 10 miles a day and go to the gym every day and I'm going to eat nothing but I'm going to drink nothing but coconut water and eat grass-fed free-range kiwi. Kiwi cannot be free-range, by the way. It's all organic. And the minute they blow their diet, they say, "Well, crap, right? I wasn't perfect." They beat themselves up, and then their effort goes to zero, right? So like they're cruising along at 100%, and the minute something goes wrong, they're like, "Well, damn, I screwed up. I'm not perfect," and so now your effort goes to 10%. Kind of like in this hypothetical person who had then the bad weekend of eating unhealthy. And the reason I say that stops you from reaching your goal is like, think about it. If you're trying to lose weight and that's why you're dieting, right? That is not easy. Like you got to really put in a lot of effort because if it was easy, everybody wanted to lose weight would lose weight, right? You got to do some work, okay? And so doing the right thing 4 days for your diet and off for 3 days, you're not going to reach your goal. Sorry. Like that's doing the right thing like 60% of the time. That ain't good enough. It's not good enough. But here's the point. You don't have to be perfect either to be good enough, right? So, in other words, if that person had not engaged in slippery slope thinking, right? And if they had just said, all right, I had the bad lunch, but like that does not necessarily have to dictate what I do for the rest of my day, and then got right back on the diet. And I realize people don't necessarily follow this kind of schedule, but for purposes of the math, let's say you have 3 meals a day, 7 days a week, you had one bad lunch. That means that 20 out of 21 meals, you did the right thing. You ate what you were supposed to do, and 6 out of 7 days, you did the right thing. You exercised, all that sort of stuff. You know what that means? What? You did the right thing 90% of the time, 85% of the time, whatever it may be. You're going to reach your goal, right? Like doing the right thing 90% of the time will get you to your goal. The only difference between 90% and 100% is how fast you get there. Quite frankly, the only difference between 80% and 100% is probably just how fast you'll get there, but you'll still get there. Now, the difference between 160%, like that person did, that is whether or not you will get there, and you won't get there, right? But this is why you don't let perfection be the enemy of good. Because guess what? A lot of the things we want in life, whether it's to lose weight or be good with money or all of these things, right? You don't have to be perfect to get them. You just got to be good. You just got to do the right thing 80% of the time. And so stop beating yourself up for not being perfect. Like if you want more like anecdotal evidence to believe me, look at it this way. People, excuse me, people that are like really in shape, like they go to the gym all the time, right? They look great. I mean, a little spoiler alert, I realize they've had pizza. Guess what? There are days when they actually did hit the snooze alarm and did not get up early and go for a run. It happens. You know what the difference is? They just do the right thing most of the time, right? They're not perfect. They still they just don't have pizza all the time, right? Most days they do go to the gym. Or it's like people that are good with money. It doesn't mean just because somebody's good with money, it doesn't mean they've never bought anything frivolously, right? It doesn't mean they've never wasted their money. It's just that most of the time they don't do it. So stop letting perfection be the enemy of good. But the reason I kind of went on that is because, hey, that's a good thing to keep in mind in life. But B, that is an example of slippery slope thinking happening with people. And by the way, this type's a fallacy, and so I'm sure you've seen people do this if you haven't done it in your life. I mean, a lot of us have all kind of done this, engaged in this type of fallacy thinking. Another thing this kind of illustrates is an important point about human behavior that people like seems to be lost on some people, which is that so this is essentially momentum, essentially, right? In this case, it's momentum in a bad direction with my example with the dieter. And you'll hear people say, well, momentum, it's not real. That's not logical. That's not rational. Like an example would be like if you're a sports fan, you hear people like in the modern trend of sabermetrics and all the, which is basically this notion, if you're not a sports fan, of like mathematics and statistics like overrunning everything, and you make every decision based on what the math is telling you, and you don't worry about things like momentum, right? And they will tell you, momentum's not a thing. Well, this is absurd. And here, because here's what they're missing, okay, all these people, is that just because something is not logical and not rational and can't be quantified, and it is true that slippery slope thinking is literally a fallacy, meaning by definition, it is not logical and it is not rational and it should not happen. The future should not equal the past doesn't mean it isn't real. Those are two things can be true at once, right? It's illogical, but it doesn't mean people don't do it. People still Momentum still matters with people. We're not NPCs, right? Uh, I just showed you that example. You know that we do this all the time. I'm sure you've experienced this, right? Where we make a decision because this is the direction we're already kind of going in, right? And so there's a difference between what's logical and rational and what's just the real world. And you don't want to lose sight of the real world, man. We're not NPCs. Um, and so that's an example of slippery slope thinking. I have this example here. If we legalize marijuana, then more people will try it. So you see this every time a state is debating legalizing marijuana, they will say, and look, you can make valid arguments for and against legalizing marijuana. You can. There are very valid arguments on both sides, by the way, um, including against it. I know most states are legalizing it now, but there's valid arguments still against it. But the point is, these arguments that say, well, it's a gateway to these other things, that's essentially a slippery slope argument, right? Because they're all separate things. Just because you legalize one thing doesn't mean you have to legalize another. Bandwagon. So this is assuming that because something is popular, it's correct or the right viewpoint. This works because for a couple of things. Some of this has to deal with our basic psychology. Sometimes in other courses, they will talk about this in psychology courses, sociology classes. Intrapersonal communication will oftentimes talk about this notion that. So there's a couple of reasons why if you're we look out into the world and see what other people are doing and make decisions and judgments based on that, and also whatever is popular, why we want to jump on. So nobody wants to admit it, but if the cool kids are doing something, you're going to want to do it too. Now, why is that? Well, first of all, it's because of just our basic, think of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you've ever seen that somewhere, it's like these basic human needs we all have. So, like, at one level, there's the need for like survival, like food and shelter and safety, right? But then there's also that need to fit in, belong, be loved, be liked, right? So bandwagon is playing on that. We all have a need to fit in. And so if something is popular, we will tend to kind of go along with it or want to agree with it or try in our head to figure out how to agree with it essentially because we want to fit in and be popular too, right? And look, that need varies by people. Like, so in other words, it's stronger in some people and a little less than others. But even for people that's not a huge thing for them, we all still have it there, right? Nobody wants to be the troll under the bridge, right? Everybody kind of wants to fit in a little bit. So that's bandwagon. Now, the reason that that's a fallacy, of course, is because the masses can be wrong, right? Like, just because something's popular doesn't mean it's correct, right? It doesn't mean they have the right viewpoint. Just because something's like the modern viewpoint doesn't mean it's correct, right? So that's bandwagon, right? So you have to be careful. Like, you want to make a decision, reach conclusions, make judgments based on the evidence or the information you have, not just because the group is going along with it, right? So that's what bandwagon is, assuming because it's popular, because the cool kids are doing it, everybody wants to do it. Invalid analogy. So this is comparing two cases as if they were similar when in reality they're not similar, right? And so what happens here with analogies is analogies work really well. It's easy as arguments. It's easy for us to think in terms of analogies because it kind of simplifies things and when we can just compare it to another situation, and also it's an easy way for us to like analyze something and go, hey, well, this is like this situation over here. So they work really well. Now the problem with them is where the two things you're comparing are not exactly the same, right? It's not the same situation, and that's where it becomes a fallacy potentially, right? And so you have this example here. If we can vote at the age of 18, we should be able to drink at that age as well. So here's why that's a fallacy. The voting age and the drinking age are, a lot of people make these kinds of arguments about age. They're like, if we can vote at some age, then we should be able to do you name it at that age as well. A lot of what they are missing is that age restrictions are set there for completely different reasons. They're assuming they're all, because they always usually end that with the tagline, well, if we can vote at 18, that means we're an adult, so we should do this other thing. Well, you're assuming that that age restrictions are always set on based on when you're an adult, and that's not when they're set. They have to do with different things. So, for example, the voting age is set at 18 based on the belief about people's sort of intellectual sort of maturity and intelligence to make decisions on what we're voting on, right? The drinking age is not set there based on that reason at all. None of those reasons. They're different reasons. The drinking age is set there on two primary things. The first one is the body and brain's ability to process alcohol and operate heavy machinery, aka a car, a vehicle. Not about understanding issues or maturity. It's totally separate, right? It's also a second reason that's totally separate is the drinking age is set at 18 or 21 based on politics. What's the politics? It's basically, are there any states that are landlocked near you, meaning you could drive to that state? It's right on your border, that have a lower age. Whichever state has the lowest age, you have to set yours there as well, essentially. I mean, you don't have to, but you're under a lot of pressure to. Now, why is that? Let's say two states, Oregon and Washington, right next to each other. Let's say Oregon sets the drinking age at 18 and Washington sets it at 21, right? What's the problem? I mean, right? All the cool kids from Washington who are living in the state where the drinking age is set at 21 and they're 19, they're going to drive to Oregon, get drunk because it's 18 there, and then drive back and get in a bunch of DUIs, right? That's a problem. So you know what that in this hypothetical scenario, you know what's likely to happen? The state that has it at 21 is going to drop it to 18 too, or try to pressure the other state to raise it, right? So there's other things involved. So those comparisons, that's why they fall apart. That's why they're fallacies. So when you make a comparison between two things, you need to make sure the cases are similar, make sure the situations are similar, the context, like all these things, to avoid it being a potential fallacy. False cause. This is a fallacy in which the speaker, somebody making the argument, mistakenly assumes that because there's a mutual relationship between two or more things, this is a correlation. One must be causing the other. So a correlation is essentially this concept that when one goes up, when something goes up, something else goes up, right? And when one thing, or maybe when one thing goes up, one goes down. And a lot of things are correlated, but that doesn't mean they're causing each other. Okay, and so you have to be careful about that. And quite frankly, you know, it's if an ex- one of the problems is beyond the fact that they might not be causing each other. And I'll give you an example of that. Another issue is quite frankly is they might have more than one cause, right? Like it only might be a small part of the cause. So an example of just flat out not causing each other would be, and this is actually a true correlation. This happens every year. So every year when in ice cream sales go up, crime rates go up. Little fun fact for you. When ice cream sales go up, crime rates go up. So is ice cream causing crime? Like, should we call, a grand jury and indict Ben and Jerry? I mean, we could probably, try to call up state and federal charges maybe um, for these guys because they're just causing a crime wave, shipping rocky road everywhere, causing a crime wave, right? Um, so what's happening? They're correlated. And by the way, when ice cream sales go down, crime rates go down. Um, but they're not causing each other, right? Now, what's happening here, by the way, is that crime rates go up in the summer, and that's when ice cream sales go up. And it's not that the heat's causing the crime either. It's just that there's more crime in the summer. There's more opportunities for crime, quite frankly. So, for example, there's more carjackings, there's more robberies, there's more identity theft because people are they're traveling, they're on vacation, they're using their card everywhere, right? And so there's more chances to steal your identity. Or you're not home and you're posting on all your socials, you're like tagging everybody with pictures telling them you're not home. And then there's more home invasions because you've just advertised your location, right? And so there's just more crime in the summer. It has nothing to do with the ice cream. So you have to be careful with correlations, just assuming it's the cause. And again, the secondary factor here is that sometimes something is okay, it's part of the problem, right? But it's a small part of the problem, right? And so you're not really focusing on the main solution. So that's a false cause. So that's an example of another fallacy. Uh, Either or, this is sometimes called a false dilemma. So this is basically when somebody comes in the room and they say, "We got two choices, right? It's A or B. We got to pick one." And usually, what they do now, first of all, the reason this is a fallacy is usually because there's more than two choices, right? They're acting like it's black and white, and there's no other colors that exist. There's no such thing as gray, right? When in reality, you do have choice 3, 4, and 5. So that's why it's a fallacy. Just right up to the top. This is the other problem with this, like, and again, sometimes it's called a false dilemma if you've like seen this in argumentation before. So they're forced these two alternatives. Another thing that they will often do when somebody makes this type of argument is they will also basically demonize one of the options. So they're lying to you by saying you only have two choices, and then they're like adding an extra layer to the lie essentially by also suggesting one of the choices is really bad. So if you don't choose the choice I want you to choose, like, yeah, you could choose the other choice, but it's just terrible, right? And so here's an example. If somebody says the government must either raise taxes or reduce services for the poor, so saying we have two choices. Well, right off the bat, that is a false dilemma. In fact, that is every time a false dilemma. Okay. So anytime they say, I need the money or we're cutting this, false dilemma. Has to be. Just has to be. Like, how can I say that? Well, here's why. No matter what the situation, here are the following extra choices that I know exist in every situation. So choice 3 that they're leaving out. Could you take the money that you currently have without raising taxes? And could you find those same services through a cheaper vendor? So, in other words, whatever services you currently offer to the poor, can somebody else offer it at a cheaper price, at the same price, so you don't need more money? And they're the same services? Could that happen? Right? Could you go somewhere else for it? There's an option. Option 4. Could you take what are you doing with the money you already have? So, in other words, is there waste in your budget or is there money you're spending in other places that can now be allocated to services for the poor? Nobody likes to answer that question, by the way. Whenever they're trying to raise taxes for something, you know, officials never want to answer, well, what are you doing with the money you got? Where'd all that money go? Right? So that's choice 4 they're leaving out. Choice 5 that they're leaving out in any situation. That's why I said this is always a fallacy. Choice 5. Can you offer different services? Can you offer alternative services? So, in other words, if you already offer the poor services 1, 2, and 3, are there services 4, 5, and 6 that are cheaper that you could just switch to and not raise taxes? So I'm still offering them something, but I'm just offering something different, right? And so they're basically painting things as this like dichotomy between one side or the other when it's more complicated than that. There's other options. So that's either or. That's a false dilemma. Be careful about that when somebody says you only have two choices. Now, it doesn't mean you're, by the way, never in a situation where you only have two choices. Sometimes you only have two choices, right? However, a lot of times it is a false dilemma. Red herring, what this is introducing irrelevant evidence to divert attention from the argument. Okay, so this is just look squirrel, right? What they're basically doing is you come in the room and you throw something into the argument, whether it's a piece of evidence or it's just another conclusion that you know is going to get people sidetracked. And the reason it's called red herring is to kind of like, it's like leaving false tea leaves on the ground, like a false trail of evidence for you to follow to get you off track. That's what they're trying to do with this. So now you can, if you're doing this on purpose, you could do this. Like, let's say we're having an argument and I just bring up something that I know is like emotionally triggering for people, or I know is just a triggering topic, and then you get sidetracked on that. You get distracted, so to speak, instead of focusing on the argument or the issue at hand. right? So that's when people will do this oftentimes strategically is they want you to get distracted, right? Like pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Wizard of Oz reference. Right? Like don't look over here where you can see Oz, right? And that's basically what they're trying to do. Now, I said on purpose because, and I also mentioned at the beginning of this video that like sometimes we just think in terms of these. And so this is not always done on purpose, okay, in terms of a red herring. So here's an example of this. Let's say somebody says there's too much violence on television, okay? And in response to that, somebody says, why should we worry about the amount of violence on television when thousands of people are killed in automobile accidents each year? So that's a red herring response, actually. Now, this person probably didn't even do this on purpose. They're just like respond. Now, look, now what are they doing here? They're trying to insert context, right? They're basically trying to say, like, okay, I get it. This may be a problem, violence on television. But we got bigger problems, and that's like gun violence. Okay. Now they may be so they're not doing this on purpose. I think in this hypothetical, what they're doing is they're trying to say like, hey, context, right? We got bigger problems. But the reason it's a fallacy response is because that's true. There are other problems that are more important, but we're not talking about them right now. We're talking about violence on television. It's not an actual response to what I'm talking about, right? And so that is a fallacy, right? That's a red herring. That's not irrelevant to the conversation about violence on television, right? It's kind of like, if somebody says clean your room and you say, why should I? Your room's dirty. That's a red herring. My room could be a pigsty. We're talking about your room and whether or not you should clean it, right? And I say people think in terms of this. Like, think about it. You know people, or how many times have you done this where you do something and or somebody does something and they justify it by saying, well, other people do it. Well, there's a couple problems. First of all, I thought you made decisions based on what you think you should do, not what other people do. Like nobody, right? Like I thought you were like your own person. So which is it? Do you do things because other people do it, or do you do things on your own and you're accountable for your own decisions? So there's that, and plus so that it's kind of like almost admitting to the bandwagon fallacy, right? But the other issue is when you say, well, other people do it, so it's cool. You're kind of using a little bit of a red herring type thinking in your own head because again, you're making the decision. You're justifying what you do because of what other people do when you're supposed to be making the decision of what you do based on what you should do, not other people, right? And so that's an example of us thinking in terms of this. Now, look, another thing about all of these fallacies, like if you think of like that example I just gave with red herrings and like us thinking that way in our own head, or even like slippery slope earlier. And I've mentioned that like we think in terms of a lot of these in our everyday own decision making and their fallacies, they're illogical. Does that mean they always lead to the wrong or incorrect outcome for your life? Maybe not, right? So I mentioned momentum, whether logical or not, doesn't mean it's not real. It's still real. Like, can slippery slope thinking lead to a good outcome? Sure, right? If it's positive momentum, right? If you're doing things in a snowball effect in a good way, you could make decisions doing things saying, well, I'm going to do this because other people do it that could lead to a good effect, right? So, something's a logical fallacy that makes it, an illogical argument. But that being said, the 2 points I'm trying to like emphasize here is that one is we think in terms of a lot of these. And so be aware of that. Be aware of where they have negative impacts. But two, I'm just also pointing out that sometimes there aren't always negative impacts, right? So you just decide what's best for your life. But be aware of what it is, right? Be aware of like the faults in the logic that's going on there and just decide for yourself if you're okay with that or not, right? So there you go. So we've got red herrings. Circular reasoning. Now, excuse me. This one, the definition can be a little bit kind of hard to understand. Like, when you read something like three times and you're like, what? I think the definition can be a little bit like that, but it's not quite as complicated as it sounds. But it's basically when you attempt to make an argument by beginning with an assumption that what you're trying to prove is already true. So what it basically means is you say A is true, right? You say that's the conclusion. That's the argument I'm making. A is true. And you say it's true because of A. So essentially, you say it's true based on the assumption that it already just is true, right? So it's like it's like circular. That's why it's called circular reasoning, right? You're going back and forth, just supporting something with the exact same statement, with the exact same conclusion, or supporting a piece of evidence with the same evidence, right? It's just circular in and of itself. And so I'll give you an example of this. And this is a little bit of a controversial sort of like example because it's a divided topic. But before you jump me, before you get all mad, I'll walk you through this because there's actually a reason I picked this example. So if somebody says women should be able to choose to terminate a pregnancy, comma, so abortion should be legal. That is not a logical statement. That's a fallacy. It's circular reasoning fallacy. Sorry. Now here's why. Again, before you get mad, just let me walk you through it. And there's a reason I picked this. So women should be able to choose to terminate a pregnancy, and then I said, comma, so abortion should be legal. You know what that says? It says women should be able to choose to terminate a pregnancy, comma, so women should be able to choose to terminate a pregnancy. You know why it says that twice? Because it says so abortion should be legal. If abortion's legal, what does that mean? It means women can choose to terminate a pregnancy. It's the same thing with different words. They said A, comma, A. If abortion's legal, women can terminate a pregnancy. So that's not evidence, right? You know what that sentence also says? It says abortion should be legal, comma, so abortion should be legal. Because again, if women can choose to terminate a pregnancy, you know what that means? It means abortion's legal. So it's circular. Now, here's why I actually picked this example. So this is a fallacy. This argument, right? This conclusion in support of abortion or pro-choice, right? So the first reason I picked this example is because just because this conclusion is a fallacy, like here, does not mean that I can't fix it. I can fix it. So you'll see this happen where people see a conclusion and it's supported by a fallacy, and then they go, well, see, that conclusion's wrong. And it's just wrong for all time. It's just wrong, period. I was teaching a class once on a particular subject, and somebody said, I don't well, the subject came up. The class wasn't on the subject, but the subject came up. And the student came up to me after class and says, well, I don't believe in that because it's always supported by a bunch of fallacies. And so, in other words, what you'll see happen is people see a conclusion and they see it supported by fallacies that they can recognize, and they go, well, see, that topic is always wrong. And they're making that's actually too big of a leap of faith there, because it does not mean the conclusion's always wrong. So, in other words, you can, just because something is supported by a fallacy doesn't mean you can't fix it and support it logically or rationally, right? And it also, quite frankly, does not mean that just because a conclusion is supported by a fallacy today doesn't mean that tomorrow there might be a logical way to support it. It's like saying just because you don't have evidence for something today does not mean you won't have evidence for it tomorrow. You might, right? And so don't throw, there's that phrase, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, it's an old man phrase, I guess, but it basically just means don't just assume the conclusion's always wrong. So let's take this example. If I wanted to fix this, all I'd have to do would be say something like, abortion is a significant medical procedure and a surgery. So therefore, abortion should be legal. Or, well, actually, here's what I should say. Abortion is a significant medical procedure. It is a surgery. These are pieces of evidence to support the conclusion. I haven't got there yet, right? And then I say, in the United States, we have always had the right to choose whether or not to undergo significant medical procedures and whether or not to choose elective surgeries, right? You can go get Botox. So therefore, abortion should be legal. I have now fixed it. I have now made a logical argument in support of abortion. So you can fix something. Don't assume a conclusion's always wrong just because it's supported by a fallacy. Now, here's a second reason I picked this. So I just made a logical argument in support of abortion being legal or pro-choice. Does that mean that everybody watching this video now has to be pro-choice? Because I just made a logical argument. No. Now, why is that? Because I can make a logical argument against abortion too, right? And so that's something that happens is you'll see people, they have a logical argument, and then they kind of do the gotcha, right? And now you have to agree with me. That's not true either, man. You know why you don't have to agree with them? Because there's a lot of topics that have logical, rational arguments on both sides, right? And abortion's one of them, by the way. You can make arguments on both sides. And so just because somebody don't just you don't have to agree with it, right? Just because something is a logical argument, because there's arguments on both sides. So just keep that in mind. So that's circular reasoning. This is very, very common. It's like if somebody says, um, uh, we should do that. That's what we do here. And you go, why? And they go, it's just the American way. And I'm like, why? And they go, well, it'd be un American not to, right? You're just saying the same thing over and over. You're just saying this is what we do. It's patriotic, right? Well, why? Because it's patriotic, right? That's circular reasoning, right? You're not giving an actual reason. So just keep in mind, you see this a lot all the time. If people just kind of like restate the conclusion and they don't actually give a reason. Ad hominem, this you're just mean if you do this. This is also really common. So ad hominem is basically attacking the person instead of the argument. So you basically walk in the room and they make an argument and you're just like, well, yeah, but you're just evil. You're terrible. You're this awful person. You're ugly, right? You're the smelly kid. I don't know. You just like attack who they are. So a modern example of this would be partisan politics. So if you ever heard the phrase partisan politics, which is certainly this is this notion of like it's like a Democrat says something, and then if you're a Republican, you go, well, I'm not going to listen to anything they said because they're a Democrat. Or if a Republican says something, and the Democrat's like, well, I'm not going to listen to anything they say because after all, they're a Republican, right? That's an ad hominem type of, first of all, thinking, because you're just attacking who they are instead of listening to what they say, right? So that's what that is. So you're not addressing the argument, you're just addressing the person. Now, where this one gets complicated is because sometimes who they are is relevant, right? Because they have a bias, right? That's influencing the conclusion. This would be sort of like somebody's giving you a piece of advice about something, and they say, oh, I think like let's say it's a product that's that's in the food industry, right? Or the food and beverage industry. And they say, well, if this is totally safe, right? There's somebody says, aspartame, which is a artificial sweetener that is in a lot of soda products, diet soda products. See me right here. This is not an endorsement. So let's say some researcher comes out and says aspartame is perfectly healthy. There's no cancer risk. Nothing bad. Don't worry about it. Enjoy Coca-Cola, right? But you find out that you point out or somebody points out that the person who said that, the research team or the doctor that said that, like they were paid by Coca-Cola to do the study, right? They were paid to like do that endorsement. That is a potential bias, right? So you can address who they are as long as but and it's not an ad hominem, right? Where it's an ad hominem is if you just attack who they are and you never explain how who they are has something to do with their actual argument, right? That's where it's a fallacy. Where you're just like, well, you're just awful and I'm not going to listen to anything, instead of explaining how they would have some way to be biased. Where it's not an ad hominem, where it's not a personal attack, is you have to discuss why it's relevant to their conclusion. Why is who they are? Why is this thing about them? Why is that biasing what they're saying? That's where you have to go. You've got to explain that, okay? And then you have to address their argument as well. So you still have to talk about what they said. Okay. You still have to talk about whatever that point was and address the actual core argument. So those are the two ways to ensure that you're not engaging in an ad hominem. But again, that one's tricky because sometimes who they are is relevant. Hasty generalization. So this is when the speaker or the person making the argument asserts a conclusion that's too broad for the evidence. So this is really common where you get a piece of information and you just extrapolate that out to a larger conclusion that's way too sweeping. So, an example here is I say, 3 members of our state legislature were convicted of corruption last year. We can conclude then that all politicians are corrupt, right? What's illogical there? Well, or irrational, right? Where's the fallacy? It's that just because those 3 were corrupt doesn't mean they all are, right? So, it's just too far sweeping. It would be sort of like if I did a study and I said, let's say I studied students at a particular college, and then I said, And I looked at one class, and let's say I took nursing majors at a college, people in a nursing program. And I gave them a survey and I said, "Do you think we should require a CPR or a first aid class for all majors? Just like all freshmen should have to just take this as just like a basic life skill." Now, if I'm surveying nursing majors, I'm probably going to get a high response rate of yes. So let's say I get in the high 80% that say yes, or maybe even 90s. And then I were to say, well, college students in this state, wherever this was done, all agree, like 90% say we should have this class, right? That is a hasty generalization because, first of all, I only looked at one college. And second of all, I only looked at nursing majors, which stack the deck, right? They're in the medical field. They're probably going to say things in the medical field are important, right? And so that's an example of a hasty generalization. You just reach a conclusion that is way too broad, and this happens all the time. So you have to be really careful about that. Straw man fallacy, what do we got going on here? So this is essentially when you take an argument and you misrepresent a position so it's easier to attack. So this can be done by oversimplification or by diverting attention to a different issue. So basically, somebody makes an argument, they say A, and what the person is using the straw man does is they rephrase it to like A asterisk. So it's something slightly different, and then they hammer it because now it's easy. And the title itself is trying to remind you of this analogy of like, what's easier? Is it easier to beat up a real person to pick a fight with them or beat up a scarecrow? It's easier to fight a scarecrow. They can't fight back, right? So that's the straw man fallacy. So I'll give you an example here. Advertisements for alcohol encourage underage drinking. Okay, that's their first like piece of supporting information. Then they say underage drinking often has negative consequences. That's their second piece of supporting information. And so therefore their conclusion is alcohol advertisements should be banned. Okay? So they've reached that conclusion because hey, they encourage underage drinking and we don't like that, so let's ban the ads. And then somebody responds by saying it's unreasonable to think you're going to stop underage drinking, right? Like minors are still going to drink. We're not going to get rid of this, right? So you see this a lot, by the way. Whenever somebody is trying to prohibit or restrict something, you name the thing, right? It is very common for people to make the argument. I say argument because this is often a fallacy straw man response. That's why I use the air quotes. They will say, well, you're never going to get rid of it, so why don't you legalize it, right? You're never going to ban it, so just legalize it. Well, here's where that's a straw man. They never, usually the person who's trying to restrict the thing never said they were going to get rid of it, right? They were just trying to not make it easy. They were just trying to like limit it, tone it down, restrict it, right? They never said they were going to eliminate it all. Okay. So like in this case, right? This person didn't say they were going to stop underage drinking. What they're basically saying is, I don't want to encourage it, which is what the ads do, right? So that wasn't their goal. Their goal was just, I'm not going to make it easy, man. I'm not going to roll out the red carpet for it, right? And so when people make that argument of, and what they're leaning into is this phrase, you might have heard this before. There's this phrase which is, you can't legislate morality, which basically means, at the end of the day, you can create laws and try to regulate things, but ultimately people are going to kind of do what they want to do, right? And that may be true, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't try to create laws and rules and regulations that are in their best interest, right? And so that's where this fallacy comes in because that's all the person's trying to do. It doesn't mean they know they're not going to stop it. They're just kind of like, not make it easy because it has some bad effect. So so here, that's all they were trying to do with this. So that's an example of this commonly happening as far as like a straw man thing. And again, a lot of people when they think this way, it doesn't even make any sense anyway. Like they say, well, you're not going to get rid of it, so why don't you just legalize it? Um, like okay, if you think that way, are you going to like stop locking your car? Are you going to stop? So when you go to bed at night, stop locking your door too, because you never get rid of burglaries and robberies. So why are you trying to stop it? Right? Of course you don't. You still don't want to make it easy, right, for people to break into your car, and you don't want them to break into your home, so you still lock your door. That's what people are trying to do with these regulations, right? So all this person was trying to do was to restrict the ads. Now, why would you use a straw man? Because it's easier to beat this up, right? Like it's if somebody came in the room and they said, I'm going to make an argument to you about how I'm going to stop underage drinking, you would know in the back of your mind, even if you're like, great, let's stop it, you would know, like, good luck, right? Like, let's see what argument you have, because I think that's hard to believe, right? So you rephrase it into something that's easy to attack, or you'll rephrase it into something that everybody would kind of now agree with you based on how you rephrased it. We see this. This is you see this a lot, by the way, and a lot of, for example, the hotly debated issues, like these things that were really divide. People tend to be divided on certain subjects, right? A lot of times, what you'll see is both sides are strawmanning each other. So they're like rephrasing the other side's position into something that the other side never actually said, right? Was never actually their argument, right? It's funny how, like, the people who are attacking it, if you think about it, like, they're the only ones saying that's what the other side thinks. Like, so let's say I'm on one side of an issue and somebody else is on the other side of the issue. This other side that's like straw manning, they'll be saying that Brian believes all of these things, but yet Brian somehow never said any of that, right? And then it would, if I was doing a straw man, it'd be like me saying, well, they said, David over here said all of these things. Yet, interestingly, you never see David saying that or supporting that, right? There's no track record of that, right? And so they just straw man each other. That doesn't happen with everything. There's things that we're like legitimately divided on, and we are sort of like addressing our core, still like root positions. But this is very common. So, I mean, I've seen it happen where, again, like I said, both sides, they're just straw manning. So that's what a straw man is. This is very common. And again, when you look at a lot of these fallacies that we've been talking about today, uh, I tried. There are a lot more, and including a lot more complicated ones. But I think it's important to kind of that we cover the ones that are the most common, and not just most common in terms of, again, everyday arguments, but also in terms of our everyday thinking, like decisions that we are making, right? How we're evaluating things, and you see all of these kind of come up. So hopefully you found this video useful, and I will hopefully see you in the next one.